We've looked at the physical environment of the Earth, but that's only half the story of geography. The other half is people. Where we live, and how we interact with the planet are all things that geographers study. This map shows the proportion of the world's population by shrinking or inflating the countries. This type of map is called a cartogram, and you can find lots more examples at the World Mapper site listed in the corner. Here we can see that Canada's population is considerably smaller than the US because it's been shrunk down, while India and China appear greatly inflated because they are the two most populous countries in the world. Russia has less than half the population of the US and appears as a thin red sliver across northern Asia. Many European countries are slightly larger than normal, but Scandinavia is smaller than usual. This map shows population density with income levels. The first thing to notice is the uneven distribution of the population around the world. Why are some areas more populated than others? Coastal areas are very popular, as are mid-latitude zones where farming is popular. Then observe the income distribution, which is quite distinct. The wealthiest countries are located in the middle latitudes, and many of them in Europe. There is a huge swath of low income and lower middle income in Africa and Asia, a lot of it in tropical regions. There are also even pockets of lower middle in areas that are otherwise solidly upper middle income. But notice that the higher income areas are pretty uniformly higher income. There are two ways to calculate population density. The first is purely arithmetic, the number of people per unit of land, such as people per square mile or people per square kilometer. The second is based on agricultural capability, so people per unit of cropland. The first shows us where people are concentrated for a variety of reasons. The second helps us understand a country's ability to feed itself. But neither one reflects the actual distribution of people across the land, particularly when mapped at the global scale, as it often is. In general, the world's population is continually expanding. The rate of growth is slowing, but there's significant variation between regions, as we'll see in a moment. Nations identified as developing, which are those that are largely agricultural, less industrialized, and often less urbanized, tend to have much higher birth and death rates and high infant mortality rates. Children are often part of the social safety net, helping to work the family farm or care for the elderly. Developed or industrialized nations tend to have lower birth rates, sometimes even negative birth rates, and much lower infant mortality rates. In service economies or cash-based economies, children are expensive. As a college student, you're probably keenly aware of the expense of raising and educating children. These countries often have child labor laws which protect children but also restrict their economic contributions. There are two methods generally used to calculate population growth. The first method is simply raw numbers, the number of births per 1,000 people, minus the number of deaths per 1,000 people, which gives you the rate of natural increase or decrease. The second method is the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children born to each woman. TFR is used most often when evaluating population growth. A TFR of 2.1 is the replacement rate. Replaces two parents plus the people who die without children. Note that this is the average. Biologically, women can have about 25 children in single birth in their fertile years. Why do we care? Well, estimates of population growth can help us plan. There are two statistics that are important to track. The first is population stabilization. This is zero population growth worldwide. All parts of the globe are at the replacement rate, or the increasing regions are exactly balanced by the decreasing regions. The second is doubling time, which is the time it takes for the world's population to double. From the start of the Common Era, or 0 BC, it took about 1,500 years for the population to double. It doubled again in only 300 years. At the turn of the 19th century, the population of the world was about 1 billion. By 1927, it was 2 billion, and by 1974, it was 4 billion. That's only 47 years. The current doubling time is about 63 years to reach double the current number, so it's evident that the doubling time has slowed, which is good, since we're closing in on 8 billion people, and it's hard to say how many the Earth will support. Here's a graph that shows the dramatic increase in population. It's estimated that we'll hit 8 billion in just a few more years, and add another billion in just 2 decades after that. This sort of exponential growth has many people justifiably concerned about the future of the planet and the future of the humans who live on it. Overpopulation can lead to a whole host of problems. But what do we mean by overpopulation? At standing room only, like in this photo, every person on Earth could fit into a single county in Nebraska. So there's obviously plenty of physical space, depending on how much room we're willing to give our neighbors. The more pressing issue is how many people can the planet sustain. If we fill all the agricultural land with people, we won't be able to grow food. Unfortunately, this is happening in many areas, which we'll see when we talk about cities. Urban areas are encroaching on nearby farmland. Thomas Malthus wrote an essay in 1798 stating that famine and war were inevitable natural checks on population growth. He stated that population increases exponentially while agriculture increases arithmetically, therefore natural controls must occur. Recent theories suggest that other means will restrict population instead of mass death. As we look at other things in this module, we'll see some of these in action. Malthus's theory included positive checks, early deaths keeping the population numbers limited. Preventive checks limit births. Sometimes this is done by legislation, as with the one-child policy in China, which permitted families to have only one child or face penalties, or forced sterilization, which was often imposed on Native American and African American women well into the 1970s, and still occurs in many parts of the world as a tool of racial and social oppression. More commonly, they consist of education and awareness campaigns, such as these 2 examples from India and Mexico. The implication in the latter is that with fewer children, there will be more food on the table and a nicer lifestyle. The video, linked here and in the description, is a U.S. campaign made by Disney to encourage smaller families after the explosive population growth following World War II. But limiting births has some complications. In many parts of the world, family planning education is not available, and even here in the U.S., it's optional and often poorly administered. A quick Google search will find plenty of examples of abstinence-only sex ed courses which have been proven ineffective. Access to contraceptives may also be a problem. Some cultural norms prohibit the use of them, and generally the more effective forms are more expensive unless you're fortunate to have good insurance. And some countries have even promoted large families to build a workforce to support the elders or promote national strength. China did this briefly following Mao Zedong's rise to power, but quickly discovered this was going to cause a population crisis. Religion can also complicate voluntary birth regulation, as some faiths prohibit the use of effective contraceptives, or even encourage large families. The use of contraception is also strongly linked to the status of women. If the status of a woman is specifically linked to child-rearing, having more children means an increase in status. If a woman's status is tied to her own accomplishments, such as a career, she is likely to have fewer children so that she can balance that status with child-rearing. So when we look at birth and death rates, or the arithmetic population increase, we use a demographic transition model. This helps identify which stage a population is in, which can help predict growth rates, and the number of dependent children and elders to be cared for. In stage 1, there are high birth and death rates. Population does not increase rapidly because the birth and death rates balance out. In stage 2, medical advancement lowers the death rate, but the birth rate is still high. Infant mortality rate is affected dramatically, but this requires a cultural shift and recognition that more children will live to adulthood, so it takes some time for the birth rates to drop without outside interference like regulation or incentives. The population increases rapidly. In stage 3, crude birth rates fall and the population growth slows as society adapts to infant survival rates. Family planning is practiced. Often, this is a result of transition from agrarian and industrial societies to service-based economies, where the value of children shifts from a free labor source to a desired outcome with economic consequences. In stage 4, birth and death rates are again similar, but both low, so population increase is once again slow. Sometimes this model is also shown with 5 stages, with the last stage being the declining population. What else can we learn about population besides density and growth rates? By mapping out population by age and gender in graphs, called population pyramids, we can identify not only the demographic stage, but other things as well. One key thing to identify is the dependency ratio. This shows how much of the population is too old or too young to work, and therefore dependent upon the rest for support. This is especially critical in countries which lack economic features like pensions or Social Security. But even Social Security relies upon a significant working population to pay into the system and support those who are currently retired. Total fertility rate and life expectancy are visible in the shape of these pyramids, as we'll see in a moment. Specific events which cause a spike or sharp decline in population for a period of years can also be identified. People are less likely to have children during times of economic stress or war, and often rebound afterwards with a baby boom. Here are a few examples. The first example, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, shows a population in stage 2 with declining death rates but still high birth rates. If this were stage 1, we would see comparatively huge numbers in the 0 to 4 group dropping off rapidly. The population shrinks dramatically as it ages, which can be a sign of limited access to health care or means of living that are hard on older adults, such as manual labor. The U.S., in the middle, is in stage 3. Family planning is in evidence, as the number of children is shrinking each year. That little bulge in the middle is the baby boomers, born between 1945 and 1965. Wars often show up in pyramids through a reduction in a specific bracket of males, followed by a surge in births. The third pyramid is Germany, which also shows lower numbers of men over 60. While this is typical because women often live longer than men, the difference here is pronounced, as men born up to about 1925 were highly likely to have been soldiers at some point during World War II. Births are decreasing in Germany to the extent that the population as a whole is declining. The U.S. is headed that direction, but as we'll see later, we more than make up for it with immigration. It's also quite informative to look at a single population over time. Here we see Pakistan, which in the mid-20th century was solidly in stage 2. Death rates were dropping, but birth rates were still high. We see a funny little bump start to show up around 1960. This reflects the turmoil happening following independence from Britain in 1947. In the 1990s, the birth rate has begun to stabilize, and we see this more clearly in the 2000 graph, where the number of children is slowing. By 2020, the population estimate shows Pakistan firmly in stage 3. So in about 2 generations, they've shifted from stage 2 to stage 3. Barring any major crises, we'll see signs of stage 4 in another couple of generations. Let's look at the 2 most populous countries on Earth, India and China. Both had very significant growth through the 20th century, but both are beginning to stabilize. In China, we see impacts of the Great Leap Forward around 1960, which was marked by huge numbers of deaths during the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961. Birth rates fell by a third, and death rates nearly doubled, leaving that big notch in the pyramid that you see. Rapid changes in government policy and other significant events of the 1960s saw mini booms and some wild fluctuation over the next decade. And the rapid growth brought about the one-child policy. In the 1980s, the policy was relaxed to allow some families to have 2 children, manifesting as spiky growth throughout that decade. Over the next couple of decades, growth is expected to stabilize and slow. By contrast, India has a much smoother curve, appearing to inflate and then start to taper off. While there was significant loss of life following independence from Britain in 1947 and wars with Pakistan and China over territorial disputes, this doesn't impact births or overall population in the same way we saw in Pakistan's smaller population. In this animation, we also see the median age increasing, which will be of concern as it approaches retirement age. In the next video, we'll look at where all these people live and how they've moved around.